Thank you, Barbara. And I actually have a timer, a new app, which I just loaded today, thanks to help with someone in the audience. So I actually need to time myself, and I will not go over. I actually took the liberty, I don't know, maybe it's a Washington thing, of actually changing the name of my presentation. I think I am going to talk a lot about grassroots, but not in the traditional sense. What I really want to spend some time talking to today is about how we got here, a little bit in terms of advocacy, and then think about the future. And I feel a little like Doug stole some of my thunder. He was like the preamble to my speech, because you'll hear many of the same themes in my remarks as in his remarks. As you know, the National Historic Preservation Act turns 50 next year. And as someone who's actually celebrated 50 years, I'm just a few years, I predate the National Historic Preservation Act by a couple of years. I know a little bit about what it's like to take some time out to think about the passage of time and the changes over time. And one of the best advice I got when I was reaching that milestone was, don't spend too much time looking back. You're not going in that direction. And I think that could probably easily be said about the historic preservation movement. Although we spend an awful lot of time talking about old places, we talk about old places within the context of where they're going in the future. And I think that is sort of, people are somewhat surprised about that, and this is a quote from someone who attended a recent convening that we did, and he was who was not a preservationist, who was just sort of amazed at how much we spend thinking about the future when our stereotype is that we spend a lot of time in the past. And I think you heard from the speakers this morning about the value of the past to the future. There was preservation happening in this country long before 1966, and I just put up a few examples here. Obviously, Mount Vernon is sort of understood as that first quintessential preservation act of historic preservation, but the Vieux Carré in New Orleans, and of course the Charleston Historic District was created long before the act was enacted. But I also put up Yosemite there because the National Park Service will be celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2016. And there are hundreds and thousands of historic and cultural and archaeological resources that have been protected through the establishment of parks. And that predates our act, the National Historic Preservation Act, by 50 years. But there was a kind of urgency that came along that precipitated the creation of the National Historic Preservation Act. And you all know this history, and I won't spend a lot of time. But there was this sort of massive reconsideration of the way we did development in this country. There was prosperity, there was population growth, there was opportunities, there was industrialization. And along with those wonderful things that happened in the post-war period, there also was some negative things that happened. And again, I think you're all aware of the sort of mythology that comes around this. The huge impact that this very short time frame development wrought upon our cities and communities. And what's amazing to me in a way, sitting from the perspective of 2015, looking at some of the pictures and the numbers of the amount of buildings that were taken down, the amount of roadway that was laid, the displacement of the whole communities of people, what's amazing to me in a way is that people in 1966 actually thought they could do something about it. They said, wait a minute here, we are not going to accept the status quo. We're going to talk about these issues, and we're going to make change in our community. And of course, this predates, they started doing this probably in the early 60s, but they really had an optimism that they could change the status quo. They did things, and again, the mythology is there, they stopped the bulldozers, they stood in front of the bulldozers, they chained themselves to the fence. They did the things that sort of activists on the ground stop the destruction kinds of activities. But they also, again, in this spirit of sort of optimism, believed that if you actually articulated why old places are important, and if you sort of developed a plan for how you were going to go about saving them, that you could create a world in which that wasn't happening. And so with Heritage So Rich was born, which again, I think most of you know this, but I'll just remind you, the U.S. Conference of Mayors sort of undertook an initiative to look at our cities, to look at the impact of the kind of developments that they were seeing, to understand how we might put in place a different approach to development in our cities. And this effort resulted in the book with Heritage So Rich, and it resulted in the creation of the National Historic Preservation Act. And it was ambitious. But if you look at what was happening at the time, it wasn't as ambitious as everything else that was happening. It was a big problem they needed to solve, and they passed a big law to solve it. Just like the Tennessee Valley Power Project. That's a huge, massive investment of time and energy. The interstate highway system, the Astrodome, heck, we were going to the moon, right? So it was not a small plan that the historic preservation advocates made when they passed the National Historic Preservation Act. And they were not alone in these legislative responses to what was going on at the time. Within a very short amount of time, in fact, sometimes on the same day, these are just 5 of the very comprehensive pieces of legislation that were passed during that period. The National Historic Preservation Act, the Wilderness Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Transportation Act, which had a lot of implications for historic preservation, and the Voting Rights Act. I mean, all in this very short period of time, and we are living with the consequences to this day of these kinds of legislative efforts. To good or evil, I'm not making a judgment, I'm just saying that they were passing the kinds of bills that had legacy implications. And we in the preservation movement are the beneficiaries of that large, comprehensive thinking about historic preservation. So what did it create? It created an infrastructure, and I won't go through all of these because I think you know them, but it created a very elaborate, and I use this scaffolding image, but a very elaborate infrastructure of how we were going to go about doing this thing, saving places. We decided it was in the public benefit. The federal government had gotten on board and said, okay, sure, go ahead. And it created a whole set of programs and approaches to saving the places that we felt were most threatened. So we have Section 110, which is really the mandate to the federal government that as a property owner in your own right, you need to take care of your house. You have to get your own house in order. And so we have federal preservation officers and processes and programs that the federal agencies themselves have to do. That then is spread to where the federal government makes investments through 106. If you're spending federal dollars and you're permitting or licensing, you're going to have to follow some rules about how you do that. The historic tax credit, again, I won't go through each one of these because I think you know them, but imagine what each one of these things, once you put them in place, how it started to spool out. We start to survey and identify where these places are. And the idea that you would be able to find all these historic places and write them on a list. And this was before Excel spreadsheets and databases. There was this real optimism again and a real ambition that we could actually do this. We could get our hands around this problem and solve it. So that these things were created, and then the states, most states kind of followed suit. You had this sort of trickle-down effect, if you will, and we have state agencies being formed, and we have state regulatory policies, and we have our local historic districts that come into play, and then we have sort of the movement itself, which is statewide and local preservation organizations, and a whole set of professionals, both consultants and people working in state government and for nonprofits, who start doing this work and become that community. And that's you, and that's me, and that's who we are. And we all came into being in this post-1966 era. So I say this, I put this up sort of jokingly, but I want you to take a minute, given all this and this history, to sort of think about a place in your mind that was saved, that is a great, continues to exist, and a huge treasure. And think of it in terms of how any piece of this, the incentives, the regulations, the people, factored into the saving of that place. So just put it in your mind for a minute. This is the H.H. Richardson designed Buffalo Psychiatric Center in Buffalo, New York, which is my hometown. And this is a building that was, even by the 1960s and 70s, was falling into extreme disrepair. Most of the patients and facilities had been moved out and moved into new buildings on the campus. It was just a big old eyesore. It was damaged in disrepair. It was people thought it was haunted. It was an ugly, looming thing. People didn't see this as beautiful architecture. They were scared to see it. And it had the psychiatric, we call it the psych center. And it was in generations believed. My parents, myself, no one ever really believed that this thing could be preserved. In fact, the only reason it didn't come down was because the city of Buffalo and the state of New York couldn't afford to tear the darn thing down. It would have been gone a long time ago if they had been able to afford to do that. But over time, grants to do feasibility studies and research and documentation and architectural designs and conversations and charrettes and eventually historic tax credits and community redevelopment block grant money and all the things that you can picture now being made possible by the 1966 Act and coming down in 2015 make possible a stunning restoration of this building. It is now being, just carefully redeveloped as an architectural center. So people are going to celebrate architecture within an incredibly great place of architecture, and a boutique hotel and conference center. So what it seemed completely lost is made possible by all those things that I talked about. And when I think you cannot imagine without it's hard to prove a negative. But if not for tax credits, if not for grant programs, if not for federal commitment to historic resources, this building would not be here. And that's maybe true of all the places that you imagined in your mind. So now we're in 2015. And we're in a very different place. And there's a big question as to whether the projects and programs and incentives and initiatives that we've put in place are still up for the challenges that we face today. And I want to share just four very quickly, because I think it's four changes, and they're sort of global changes, and then I'll talk more specifically about historic preservation, but I think they're really important to keep in mind when we think about the difference. I tried to sort of set the stage of what the world was like in 1966, big ideas, big plans. We're not in that place. We know how Congress operates. We're not seeing these ambitious things. We can barely get sort of the day-to-day work of Congress as we're heading to almost possibly another federal government closure. We're not thinking in terms like that. And there has been immense change, and I think I'm just going to dive into what I see as the preservation changes. We're not tearing buildings down willy-nilly. It happens sometimes, and certainly in places like Detroit, where you're getting sort of the neighborhood stabilization programs are putting in lots and lots of money for demolition. But in most of our communities, buildings are not coming down on a day-to-day basis and not in huge numbers. They're coming down through demolition by neglect. They're coming down by disinvestment. They're coming down because people aren't taking care of them. And there's no place to tie yourself to. There's no wrecking ball to stand in front of. And so some of the ways that we had, the regulatory things that we put in place and the ways we used to try to save that don't quite come into play when you're talking about an owner simply not making sure the water is turned off or that the building is sealed. And there have been aspects of demolition about neglect ordinances and those kinds of things, and some have worked and some have not. But I would argue that we have not figured out this way, an adequate way to prevent demolition by neglect, and to really take into account its dire impacts in our communities, that gradual drift as opposed to the tsunami. And I flip it over and say, in reverse, we also have not been particularly good at honoring people who simply take care of their buildings. We make a big deal. We love the before and after, the building that's on the brink and is brought back through the national tax credit, and we've invested $3 million or $15 million. And I was struck by the senator who mentioned the Minnesota State Capitol. And whenever I hear that, I'm so glad they're investing all that money to renovate the Capitol, but I'm wondering, what have you been doing for the last 50 years that you need that big of a one-time investment of money? And I know that these things happen, but we need to honor the slow and steady preservation that happens. The building facilities manager who just makes sure that the buildings are up and running and being taken care of, and that he gets the HVAC checked once a year. We don't do that in our communities either, as well as we should. The other is the movement of no, and Doug alluded to this, but when you look at those pictures of the early days, you can imagine that no was the right answer. Absolutely no. And in my career, it's getting longer now as we talk, I've said no many, many times, and I've even said no stamping my feet. I've been saying no so loud. no is appropriate in many occasions, but what has happened is it has become the way we are perceived as the movement, that all we are the people that tell you what you can and can't do with your building. And so as Doug suggested, I do this mental exercise too, when somebody suggests something and I just want to cringe. But instead of cringing, I think the answer is yes. I don't know how it's yes. I'm not quite sure how we're going to get to yes, but let's start with yes, and hopefully we can move the project in such a way that it gets to a preservation solution that we can all live with. We need to be coming to the table with the solution, not with the regulation. And I know many of you, serve agencies and are in positions where you are the enforcement part of this equation, and it's a harder task to do. But I think sometimes it's a lot with language and perception of how we do our work. We were so forced into a crouch of having to say no that we got really good at that. And if there's a way that we can open it up and start with, that's a great, and I think, as Doug said, that's a great idea, let's talk. And I know that's a little simplistic. In practice, we're gonna have to figure out how it works. But that movement of no has really undermined our ability. And the other thing too is, I'm a mother of 2 children, and sometimes you need to pick your battles, and I'm sure you all pick your battles every day. But picking our battles and not allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good is something that we all need to think about. And I'm saying it to myself as well in the work that we do at the National Trust. But we can change that equation. The other thing is, there are so many historic resources out there. This is the Marbella handball court in Los Angeles. You look at this thing and you're like, really? But this is incredibly important in that community. It has a long and storied history. It is still an important place in that community. It brings older generations and younger generations together, all the kinds of things that we expect to happen in historic places and we want to happen in historic places. But figuring out what preservation has, what we can bring to preserving this place, given our current toolbox. And I was speaking with Erin from Preservation in the Lands of Minnesota last night, and she said, it's not that we're saying no to these people. They come to us and they say, we want to preserve this space, and we got nothing. All of our incentives, require a certain standard, a level of integrity, a level of documentation. And these buildings simply don't fit the model that we currently have. And in that regard, we are saying no to much of these historic resources. And that means that's a whole lot of historic resources out there. We know that only 8% of properties listed on the National Register represent diverse resources and communities. 8%. So clearly, we're not figuring out a way to bring those into the equation. And talking about scale, I'm sorry this is a little blurry, but my colleagues at the Preservation Green Lab have been doing a lot of work on just really sort of laying out the universe in which we work, and sort of understanding historic fabric in cities. They've been doing this work in, here's 4 cities that they've mapped out, doing data mapping, metrics, et cetera, about building age and type and whatever. And it's not making any judgments, it's just getting the lay of the land. And as you can see, in this country, huge amounts of our building stock are from 1945, we've built before 1945. So if you have 100% of the buildings in New York, 62% of them were built before 1945. This huge building boom that the United States experienced. Most of the resources that we are engaged with as preservationists, 62% of the cities, or 66%, et cetera. So it's in that 60% range. That's a lot of buildings, and that doesn't even take into account the recent past, which we also care desperately about, and buildings that will slowly be coming online. But of that 60%, we've only touched 4%, 5% of those that are on the National Register or locally designated. This is a tiny, tiny space that historic preservation is playing in. And it's not surprising that when I go into a city to plan a conference, and I'm doing a conference of 2,000, and they say, well, the quilters are coming, and they're bringing 80,000 people. Why can't we have 80,000 people in a room talking about historic preservation? And I love quilting, and don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying, it is amazing to me that we cannot mobilize more people to this when it's so inherent in the way we live our lives and the work we do. But the way we do preservation now, we touch such a small fragment of buildings. And we do it really well. You know, those buildings that are locally designated, especially those that are locally designated, and those that are on the National Register, many of them are pristinely preserved, and it's wonderful, but it's so small scale, and it's not transforming communities. And we can continue to work in that space, or we can think of our work much broadly. And I would, you know, I guess I'm kind of ambitious, because I think what we do is so important and so critical to and can make such a difference in our communities that we need to think beyond that. And then there's climate change. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because I'm not an expert in climate change and all of that. But there is an understanding that the threats to historic resources in terms of sheer numbers of properties and resources that will be lost over the next 50 years, 100 years, is far outweighing anything we've ever experienced. Any of the natural disasters that have hit our communities, and you know that there's some of our communities that have been very stricken by whether there's been tornadoes that have taken out whole downtowns or floods. We're going to lose a lot. It's more of a threat than we saw in mid-century. We could say it's inevitable and we're going to have to let these properties go. Or we could be like the people in 1966 and say, okay, let's roll up our sleeves and figure out how we're going to deal with this. We may still lose them, but we could put in place programs and approaches that could save these buildings. And I see it as that same level of potential destruction that we were witnessing in the 1950s and 60s, and figuring out how we can be as creative and forward-thinking as they were. So in 2015, some people actually believe we can meet these challenges. You'll hear it from each other. I think all of you, I put all of you in that context. So I just want to talk briefly about a couple of the grassroots pieces that I think we can be engaged in. There will not be a presidential bill signing. I think those days are over. We are not going to see some massive piece of legislation that transforms the preservation movement again. It's not going to happen. It's going to have to return to the people. And that's where this notion of what we can do in our communities and in our own way that we conduct the work that we do can be as transformative as a massive piece of legislation. And so I'll talk about a couple of ideas, but I really want to say that this is a work in progress. If you accept some of my premises about where I think we are in preservation, and they're not just mine alone, it's what I've been hearing as I'm lucky at the job that I have at preservation, at the National Trust, that I get to hear a lot, I get to read a lot, because a lot of those, as you heard, the conference and the journal and the publications come under, so that's all stuff that I spend a lot of time on, and I'm very fortunate to that. So a lot of what I've said today is not my own original thinking, it's my sort of sussing through and trying to organize what I've been hearing. But having said that, I think it's only just the beginning. And I think it's a conversation that's happening all around the country. We've been convening folks, and I have a cool slide. We've been convening folks in small groups, both preservationists and non-preservationists, and every time we start talking about the future of preservation, we ran through the meeting notes from a couple of the meetings, and we ran through a bunch of journal articles that we're doing for our fall journal, and we put them in a Wordle. I don't know if you've ever done that, but you put all the words in, and the words that are used most often become larger, right? So that you get a ratio. And I was struck, and I think this is fantastic, that in all those conversations and those recent writings, that people is almost as big as preservation. I mean, of course you would hear preservation, of course, but the next, and by far the next biggest word used most frequently when people talk about the future is people. And that's you, and that's me, and that's our communities. And that is not the established preservation community. Or it doesn't have to be just the established preservation community. So just a couple, and again, so I said this, a couple of ideas about where we may want to go, but I hope that what I really want to do is start the conversation. You know, the anniversary is not till next year. We have an opportunity to to start thinking about these and really start talking as a community, aspirationally, theoretically, before we'll ever get to the point of actually doing anything specific. So I hope this is just generating a conversation. Here's 3 ways that I think we could act from a grassroots level to change the equation for preservation in this country. The first is what we call the democratization of historic preservation.
And that is where everybody gets to decide. When we have a system where there are that only certain people have the authority to decide what is important, and I'm not saying I'm being extreme in that thought, but that's the way it's perceived from the communities, is that you people over there decide what's important. When everyone is empowered to say what's important, that changes the equation, because then they're part of the process, they're part of the movement. And here's the National Trust has a This Place Matters campaign. We did it, we spooled it out a few years ago, and we're sort of reigniting it now. But what is so amazing about this, and I hope that you all have participated in some ways, is they get to decide. You get to stand there and you get to say what you think matters. And people feel really empowered when they can do that. And once you make that statement, you become a preservationist in a way. Once you said this place matters, the next step is, if it matters, what am I going to do about it? And that is an opportunity for us to allow people to make the decision about what matters and engage them really in that discussion by not having a barrier to what matters. The other, and this is my little finger pointing, but I made it a very endearing finger point, as opposed to, this Uncle Sam needs you. I was looking for clip art. Is call preservation when you see it. If our definition of preservation is a narrow definition of what it means to save a place, and Doug again sort of took my thunder, but if your definition is really narrow, then you're right, we've only saved 5% of the buildings in our communities. But if you think more broadly about what preservation is, so the community gardens and the brew pub and the person who fixes their roof, the homeowner who puts a new roof on is engaging in historic preservation, because that house has history and it's now being preserved. And we don't call them that. We don't call it out and say that's historic preservation. I want to have this sort of, I don't know if you've ever been in a preschool where you get caught being good, or you get caught being nice and they give you a little sticker. I want to do the same thing. I caught you preserving something. You didn't think I saw, but I saw you preserving it. You Mr. Walgreens. I used this example last night. I was at a conference and Walgreens was giving, the woman, it was a GIS conference, so she was talking about how they use GIS. But all the pictures on her slide were of Walgreens located in historic buildings. And I went up to her afterwards, I said, wow, that's kind of cool. She said, well, those are our best stores, they're so great. She loves them. Let's say, way to go, that's preservation. They probably didn't even think in those terms that what they're doing is preservation. And we know all the times we've told them we didn't want them to do stuff because we've battled Walgreens all across the country. But that if we could get that momentum to start naming what we don't traditionally name as preservation, we could suddenly broaden the tent. And finally, we have to develop programs that really understand that this 1960s rambler, that's what they call him in my area, this rambler. This rambler is not Mount Vernon. And we have to be nuanced enough to figure out how to deal with both of those buildings. And I don't have exactly the answer to that, but I know it's what we have to do. We have to find a way to talk about Mount Vernon and a rambler as both being valuable and in need of preservation, but the way we actually accomplish that preservation can be very different. And until we do, I think we're going to be stuck with the 5%. So, our greatest challenge is finding those tools. We have in place lots of tools, and they're wonderful for a certain category of building. They work. We've saved lots of places. You all imagined. There's 100 people in this room. There was 100 buildings you were all imagining. But you have to find a way to build the toolbox in a way and get more creative and more flexible and more nuanced in the way we do this work for us to be able to tackle those issues that I talked about. Climate change, demolition by neglect, the diversity of resources we're going to be facing, the movement of no, maybe it was 4, maybe it was 5. We can do that, but we need to be as smart and as optimistic and as ambitious as they were in 1966. And most of what we have to do is recognize that it's going to happen in our communities and it's going to happen through individuals. It's not going to happen through major government programs. So that's that.
I want to end. I put this picture up just as we talk because I think it's about embracing the full range of historic preservationists, whether they cut all the stripes that they come in, from that homeowner to the developer who rehabs that building, to our people in the SHPO office, and I don't think SHPO is a four-letter word. I actually was going to count to tell you how many, how many letters there actually are in those four words, but to embrace that full diversity of our own movement, and by so doing, actually take us into the next 50 years. So I would love to take questions or hear your reactions.